All right, hi everybody, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in the Clubhouse of Development webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing your board of directors and their role in your fundraising efforts. Before I tell you a bit about Cogeo and your speaker, I want to say that if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to use the GoToWebinar tool and we'll make sure to review those before you sign off today. All right, I'll introduce ourselves to you. So Cogeo specializes in sports-related 501c3 fundraising and organizational sustainability. Our work spans multiple sports with the nonprofit industry and geographical regions within the U.S. The Cogeo management team has 70 years of fundraising experience and has raised over $750 million for more than 200 nonprofit organizations. One key reason that we're passionate about working with sports organizations and specifically soccer clubs like yourselves is that our executive management is involved and play the game themselves both as soccer players and coaches. And that includes your speaker today, Rob Cusell. As a college All-American and highly successful soccer coach, Rob is now the managing director of consulting services at Cogeo and has helped hundreds of sports organizations implement strong organizational development and fundraising strategies. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Mel. So if we look at slide number 3, you'll see the progression for Tennessee. This is the second webinar, and we're going to focus on the board of directors. If you're a 501c3 or a foundation of a for-profit club, you'll have a board of directors, and it's best to understand what their role should be as it relates to fundraising and in general. The next slide, again, leveraging the Clubhouse of Development, understanding where each board member impacts each of the tactical areas from bottom to top. And we'll focus only really on fundraising, not on PR or website or any of that stuff, but just annual giving events, corporate major gifts, and then capital campaigns and stewardship. So the next slide, number 5, goals and context for today. There's 4 areas we're going to cover. What's the role of the board? Really a better awareness of understanding of the planning process and procedures required of the board of directors or trustees to be successful with fundraising activities. Evaluation, how to analyze and evaluate current board leadership practices. We'll look at that. What activities should they be involved with and responsibilities around the Clubhouse of Development? And then we'll touch on strategic retreats and why they're critical to understanding the overall board's role and success potentially within the Clubhouse of Development. So slide number 6 is data-driven, and this was a study that was done in 2017 by the Stanford Business School, Stanford University School of Business and Management. And they did a thorough analysis of leadership and management within the 501c3 sector, and most heavily on board of directors. And what they found was that the greatest struggle areas for nonprofits was board governance and funding. So over half were deemed struggling, which is really concerning. And then impact evaluation, strategy, organization and talent, and then mission and insight and courage were last. So we know that these are issues, board governance and then funding as it relates to board involvement. Empirical data definitely points that way. So the next slide. So the word strategic retreat gets thrown around. Well, what is it? What is a strategic retreat? Well, for Cogeo, it's a dedicated session for the board, key stakeholders, and select staff to perform a process to evaluate and determine the club, agency, academy, league, governing body, whatever it is, strategic imperatives and priorities for the short term and then longer term. So really, it's looking out 1 to 5 years. And generally, the process includes a SWOT analysis, which is looking at internal and external strengths, that's the S, weaknesses, W, opportunities, O, and then threats. So doing that as a group, analyzing the results of the SWOT analysis, and then restructuring board level subcommittees to really make sure that whatever strategic imperative has emanated from the retreat gets addressed logically through subcommittee work mostly. And the takeaway here, it's absolutely vital to consider performing a strategic retreat on a consistent basis. And we feel that there should be a maximum 5 years between any strategic retreat. Because it sets the vision, the direction, and the relevant action for the subsequent years, and then optimizes all processes towards maximizing the club's goals as it relates to board and executive management. Next, slide number 8. So what are the components of a strategic retreat? There are really two macro components. The first is a SWOT analysis. As I mentioned, these are internal and external. And really, it's just summarizing those, and then preliminary findings come out of the session. And then a report is submitted to the board subsequent to the retreat, which should be no longer than a 4 to 5 hour exercise for a club, because there aren't that many, there's not much legal stuff going on, generally speaking. The report will set the strategic priorities and have executive summaries around each of those priorities, determine subcommittees, and whether they're ad hoc. Ad hoc means it's not going to go on forever. And then you can bring in outsiders to get expertise. Standing committees are things like executive committee, finance committee, development committee, buildings and grounds committee, which is relevant for clubs for the most part, particularly if you have a facility. And then making sure that you've got the right people that are staffing these subcommittees that are addressing the strategic imperatives of the club for the next 5 years. So people ask us, well, what should my board look like? And there's only one answer. The composition of the board should enhance the subcommittee performances, which is to say, if in fact the strategic imperatives are A, B, C, and D, then you need people with expertise in A, in B, in C, and D. So that's really the most important thing. So what are the outcomes once you've got the proper setup, in other words? So you've done your strategic retreat, and it's been determined that their subcommittees have been identified. So we'll start with the left-hand side. So the full board, the committees, it's really pretty straightforward, right? You've got a board of directors or trustees, and generally you've got an executive committee that's comprised of the president, the vice president, or the chair and vice chair, the secretary and treasurer. Then you've got members at large, and that's determined by the bylaws. We recommend that clubs have bigger boards so that you can be inclusionary and have bigger outreach. And then any emeritus. Those are lifelong board members, people who may have termed out but are so valuable to the club that they take on an emeritus status. You see that a lot at universities and independent schools, as well as hospitals. So again, the executive director, CEO, or director of coaching, technical director, president, they're also part of the board, and generally sit on the executive committee as well. Whoever the top employee at the club is or the academy, that person will be on the board. And then subcommittees, and again, this is hypothetical, but in this case, the standing committees that recommended executive committee should always exist. Board governance committee, really development committee, finance committee, and facilities committee. So we have a trick question here that we ask anytime we do a in-person presentation, which is, bar the executive committee, which is the most important subcommittee of the 4 that are outlined here? Board governance, development, finance, or facilities? The answer is board governance, because they're the people that are going to recommend other people that are going to staff all the subcommittees. So board governance, or the committee on directors, or whatever you want to call it, recruiting, director of board of directors recruiting committee, whatever you want to call it. That's the most important one because they're staffing subcommittees. And then ad hoc committees, as I mentioned, those are time limited, they're specific, they're project based. So whenever we put together a complex for a club, we definitely bring in either an advisory group or steering committee for the campaign that's well beyond the board of directors. In other words, people that are not on the board of directors may have been in the past, but who could be really helpful in terms of executing on the campaign. That's a good example of an ad hoc committee that gets created, lasts about 3 years, 3 to 5 years, and then goes away once the facility is built. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you really want to do a serious assessment of your current board as it relates to the strategic imperatives that have been decided by the strategic retreat. And to do that, you want to create a board matrix. Mel, why don't we click on that and show them? I tweaked it a little bit. And so what you've got is names on the left, who are the members, and then their influence and qualities. And then there should probably be a sheet 2 or something below there that outlines who the prospects might be, as well as their qualities. So it's a really helpful document that makes sure that you're getting the right people across these particular intellectual property areas. So visionary, marketing, on nonprofit boards or administration, involved with foundations, really smart on finance, understands programs, is a lawyer, an entrepreneur, again, lawyer, or redundancy. Back to the presentation. So the board composition optimization really revolves around recruiting the right people once you've identified them, onboarding them correctly, giving them a mentor, make sure you have a strong mentoring program, train them correctly, maybe a handbook or something, and then involve them, put them on subcommittees, make sure they're involved and engaged with whatever qualities they bring. And then you also want to manage the board matrix. And that should be looked at. The board governance committee should be meeting on a monthly basis or at a minimum on a quarterly basis. And ideally, you're bringing in classes of board members. So every year or whatever the term limit says, you don't just bring in one board member, but 2 or 3 at a time, so they feel like a group. So next slide, number 10. So what are the outcomes, right? You have real processes. We run into a lot of boards where they're not even sure if they have term limits. Some board members have been on forever, not always for the better. And there's real inconsistencies in terms of processes. That's generally not a good thing. So what are the key processes? We should be very clear on board terms. And what if there is a renewal process? What does that mean? Give you an example. A term could be 3 years plus 1 renewal of a term, so 6 years total. And then they have to go off for a term. They can't be invited back until 3 years after that. That's a really good example. The role of the board chair should be defined. What does she do as board chair? What are her responsibilities and relationship with the executive director? Executive director, director of coaching, and the board chair relationship. That should be a very horizontal relationship. It should be a trusting relationship, a working relationship. Yeah, the executive director reports to the board, but not to the board chair, right? So it should be really tight. Generally, it's best if the executive director has a say in terms of formation of the board and who's on that board. And then board meetings should definitely occur. And again, it's not unusual for us to talk to a client or a prospect. They'll say, well, no, our board hasn't met in a few months, actually. And so you've got to make sure that happens. And we highly recommend consent agendas, which is really the work gets done at the subcommittee, and then the subcommittee provides a report to the secretary, who then aggregates all the reports, and then that's submitted as a consent agenda with really very little discussion, so that you can focus on their real duties. And what are those duties? 2 areas, right? And this is assuming that there are enough resources to carry out programs and to make sure that programs are being run without too much board volunteer involvement. That is an issue with clubs that we see, and it's not a good thing because you really do want them focused on the long term, not on the short term. Even if it means increasing membership dues to be able to hire enough people, that's a good thing because the board should be focused on two areas. The first, as I mentioned earlier, the executive director, whoever the highest employee is, reports to the board, right? So they have oversight of the executive director, and the other area that they govern is the financial well-being of the agency, fiduciary responsibility. They're the ones setting dues. They're the ones who are, trying to get tournaments together to bring in more revenue, et cetera. That's important. And so the other way to grow fiduciary, right, is fundraising, development. And so the board should be involved in development, right, if they're going to do this responsibly. And that's it. So overseeing the executive director, fiduciary responsibility, which to get more revenue should involve fundraising. So now let's look at slide 11. We'll start looking specifically at the role of the board in each of the rooms of the clubhouse, the House of Development. So the first room on the left is annual and membership giving. Each board member should make an annual contribution, and that's the most important. By the way, the bold is the most important thing for them to do. So they should make an annual contribution. I'll explain why in a second. They should assist with stewardship, and then they should introduce the executive director to as many potential donors, businesses, partners as possible. Why should they make an annual contribution? One, to lead by example. Two, that they can then ask others to join them in making a gift to the club. And then three, that has to do with the corporate and foundation room on top, because if in fact you're going to do foundation grant writing, part of your tactical stuff, which you would definitely if you're working with us, then you need to have 100% participation from the board in order to qualify for most grants. So that's annual membership giving. How can they help with events? 4 areas. They can host a cultivation event or a regular event, whether it's a gala, a soccer-thon, a juggle-thon, a golf outing, or they can attempt, when possible, if they're available. If there's stuff that's being sold or contributed to raffles or auctions or silent auctions, they should contribute as board members and then purchase if they're attending the event. They should assist with stewardship, post-event stewardship if asked. And then the most important thing for them to do, again, because of their fiduciary responsibility of the agency, is to evaluate the return on investment of the event and the return on mission, right? How was it of community benefit? Did we actually make money given the output that we had to do for this? And we see a lot of events that just don't have the return on investment to be justified, where the money could be raised in one major gift meeting. So again, 4 areas: hosting, attending, and then contributing or purchasing, assisting with stewardship, and most importantly, evaluating the return on investment on the event or 2 events that each club might do every year. So what's their role with corporate and foundations? This is probably one area that they can influence the most. There's 6 areas here. They can help identify qualified businesses, prospects that ought to be approached for sponsorships, naming rights, etc., things like that. They should introduce as much as possible, assist with visits and solicitations, review internal leadership, and then augment on stewardship when asked. But most importantly, they need to cultivate and engage individuals who run businesses, who are part of larger corporations, and engage them as much as possible, particularly if they're current parents in the club or past parents in the club. As a board member, they have clout, and they can basically really act on behalf of the club by cultivating and engaging as many small businesses as possible. And when we do the webinar in corporate, we're going to speak specifically about the 4 types of businesses and how to engage each type of business. That'll be a lot of fun. Again, 6 areas: identify, introduce, assist, review, and then augment. In terms of now for foundations, that the reviewing of internal leadership, which is that they're boards of directors of foundations, they're the one making funding decisions. That's where you want to leverage board members in terms of their own relationships. You're submitting, let's say, submitting a proposal to the local community foundation, right, in Nashville or wherever. Well, who's on the board of if there is one, of the Nashville Community Fund or Nashville Community Foundation, right? Who's sitting on that board, right? Who's sitting on the Rotary board, right? Clarksville, who's on the Clarksville Rotary board, for example, right? So you want to make sure that they're engaged in terms of looking at leadership of whatever partner you're trying to partner with, whether it's a sports authority, whomever, city council, etc. So the middle room on the second floor of major gifts, they can play a huge role here. And this is a program that can be launched literally immediately once the preparation phase is done, which is to say it takes about 2 months to get a case statement together. And again, we'll do an entire webinar on major gifts. But the board's involvement here is literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9-fold. So if they themselves are wealthy, if they have capacity, they should consider a major annual gift as their annual gift. They should review wealth screening lists that are provided of membership. And you don't have to put the actual wealth. They can just review. They don't need to know the actual wealth of the member. So when we review wealth screening lists with clubs, we generally give them a list without the numbers, without the net worth. That way they're not. And so the only people that see the actual net worth are the people on the executive team that are working with us directly. They can review the annual case statement and get really comfortable with it and knowledgeable about it. Again, they could host a cultivation event for major gifts in this case. They could attend other cultivation events that are being hosted by other people. They can join the executive director or the director of coaching or the technical director in major gift meetings. They're not going to make the ask, but they can certainly be supportive in saying that they themselves have made a gift. And they can, when asked, augment on stewardship. In other words, let's say Sheila Smith makes a gift. It's a nice gift. She gets a formal thank you from the club, but we know that Laura Engel knows Sheila. Well, you ask Laura to thank Sheila in addition to the stuff. So that's how you augment on stewardship, where there's a relationship. And then during the major gift webinar, we'll talk a lot about moves management, which are intentional moves that you put on people so that you move them along toward a gift. And the most important thing they can do is number 2, which is connect others with financial capacity to the agency. So much like in the previous slide when we talked about how they can connect into businesses and business leaders, same thing here, right? If they in fact know people, other club members, past members, family connections of members with financial capacity and affinity to help them connect them to the executive director. So then the executive director, can go and make an ask. So I won't review all the areas, but again, there are 9 key areas, the most important of which is connecting again. So board member, I think you're starting to see trends here, right? They need to give, whatever level they're comfortable, and they need to connect, and then do all the other stuff that's ancillary. Okay, slide number 15. So what about a capital campaign? If your club's in a capital campaign, and generally speaking, for the most part, the capital campaigns that we're doing right now, and we're doing a lot around the country, are really around facilities, right? So it's just looking at either an existing facility or putting together a new facility. And like I said, we're doing it from coast to coast right now, whether it's renovating the Orlando City Seminole Soccer Complex, which is happening, all the way out to Oregon, where we're planning for a new state-level complex just south of Portland on Interstate 5, and then anywhere in the middle of the country. Lake Country Soccer in Springfield, Missouri, that's being renovated. Walnut Creek in Northern California, they're putting together a 2-field complex. Ballistic, right next to Walnut Creek, they're putting together a futsal complex. So they're all doing capital campaigns. Cal North, which is a governing body, one of the two governing bodies for Northern California, they're going to renovate 3 facilities that they're managing around Northern California. So that's going to take about a decade. But that's going to happen. But it requires a lot of work on behalf of the board. And again, there are 8 ways that they can always help with a capital campaign. They themselves can invest at the highest capacity possible, making a gift. And again, as connectors, they should join the campaign advisory group or the steering committee, whatever the semantics. It's a group that really sole focus is on making sure that the campaign is moving forward in a positive way. The third thing they can do is review well screening lists, much like they would do in a major gift campaign. They should review and be comfortable, very knowledgeable about the campaign case statement, several of which are on our website. You can check them out. Identify steering committee members, non-board members that would be strong campaign advisory group or steering committee members. They should attend all campaign events. They could co-host a campaign cultivation event. And then again, augment on donor stewardship where it's relevant or where they're asked to. Same concept, right? Sheila now is making a gift to the capital campaign, right? And then Laura, again, has to come in and thank her once that gift. So it's the same thing as major gifts. You really want to make sure that you're doing a lot of thanking because all donors love to be thanked. They might tell you they don't, but they do. So again, most important thing they can do in a capital campaign is stay involved, really get involved, invest at the highest capacity, join the campaign steering committee or campaign advisory council or advisory group, review well screening lists, review campaign case statement, identifying steering committee members that are not board members, attend, host an event for the campaign, and then augment on stewardship. Next slide is, well, stewardship, right? It's a really important part of any organization's fundraising activities, right? Because that's how you renew gifts. And we've got all sorts of tactics and protocols for major gifts in particular and capital campaign stewardship, where we're doing quarterly moves on any large gift that comes in over the course of a year, which those quarterly moves, no other nonprofit is doing that, at least unless they're working with us. So it gives us a huge advantage, particularly as it relates to foundations and businesses, many of whom are in the business of giving away money, at least a branch of businesses are. So if you can outdo your competition by having really strong stewardship, then you're going to be in a really good position for the next few years and hopefully forever. And the board needs to be involved, right? Particularly if they're on the development committee, they need to ensure that best practices that I just described, for example, are in place. Not just because a lot of giving right now is going online. So what we're seeing are thank you forms that are just being generated by whatever system is being used to transact the transaction, and that's it. That's not enough. It's not enough at all. So make sure if the board members are on the development committee, make sure that the best practices are in place. That's there. Why? Because again, they are fiduciary responsible for the agency, and this will make sure that gifts come in year to year, and then again assist with it when requested. Same methodology that I described earlier. Okay, next 2 slides, we're going to conclude with this. So what are the key takeaways? Pretty simple. Fundraising development, capital campaign success will be significantly enhanced if the board's participating in an ongoing fashion. And board members should consider participating in every room of the House of Development if it's currently relevant, right? So if you're not in a capital campaign, that's not relevant. The other rooms should all be relevant if you're doing this stuff. Good governance, planning, and execution are keys to success. So again, that's the board's role, which is responsibility, therefore governance. And most importantly, you really should seek outside help to facilitate this, particularly as it relates to a strategic retreat. They'll bring objectivity, expertise, and most always, well, we find always, the comprehensive House of Development process is new to most board members, unless they've been on a university board or an independent school board or a hospital board, where that's pretty much done. And then move the development report to the top of the board of directors meeting agenda. Why? They're fresher. And why does development always get talked at the end? Because nobody really wants to do it because it's actual work. It's the one area where they got to get out of their comfort zone and sell and make the case and engage. It's work. Now, that's why it's a difficult thing to do. Now, I'll leave you with this thought. And this is really important because boards are critical because they're making decisions on behalf of the agency. And we find that in this area, sometimes agencies aren't moving because board of directors aren't moving. I'll give you a counterexample. Last night we gave a presentation to Hawaii Soccer. And so it was a very late presentation. And it was the executive director, his administrators, and then the board of directors. Now, this was great because in this case, the executive director has a lot of power. And it was more of it wasn't really an interview. It was more sort of a routine, let's get to know Cogeo before we start work with them. And we saw that as the ideal scenario where you had trust, where they were listening, they were engaging, had a couple good questions, but really were not at all getting in the way. You didn't have somebody there who said, well, asking dumb questions or just being a pain. They were all engaged, and it was a super good meeting. And that's always a good formula. Why do I say this? Because what we know is, because we're making the market, so we know how many people are adopting. And good news, in the last 2 weeks, we've adopted a client in Utah, one in Frederick, Maryland. I just talked about Hawaii. So it's really churning well. But it's a new market. So if you're not doing this, you're not a black sheep, because the market is just now being made. There's more awareness about the fact that this is a huge opportunity for clubs. And ideally, the board of directors will not get in the way of this kind of decision making, because unfortunately, we do see some of that where there's reluctance on the board's part, because they don't want to, they want to keep the lifestyle company going. They don't want to get out of their comfort zone. And so it's really important that they get all the right educational tools so that they can, and we hope this will help them understand their importance and how important this is to the agency moving forward. So I'll stop with that, Mel, and I'll let you close it out.
Great, thanks, Rob. We do have a couple questions submitted, if you don't mind. First of which being, is there anything wrong with player parents being board members?
Absolutely not. Here's the key, though. We know that I'm going to give you the macro response and really take this seriously, because there are two types of board members. Two types on a macro sense. There are those people that come in because they really want to see the club thrive. They want to see the club do well. They really want to make an impact, and they're there for all the right reasons. Those are great board members. So as long as the parent in question has those characteristics and is not in there for their kid and watching out for their kid's interests, right? That's great. On the other hand, if they're doing what I just described, which is they're in it for themselves, they're in it for ego replenification, they're in it for status, they're in it to protect their kid, they're in it, for fiefdom protection of their team, that's no good. And we see a lot of that, unfortunately. And the worst kind of board in terms of board composition is where they're voted in. We've got 2 clients currently around the country where that's the case, and you basically have dysfunctional boards because they're not in it for the 2 reasons we talked about earlier, which are fiduciary responsibility, therefore business development and proper management, and then making sure that you've got the greatest leadership possible, much like in Hawaii, where the CEO is phenomenal. So yeah, they can be on the board as long as they have the qualities that I just described. Great question.
Great, thanks. One more. Who is accountable for making sure board members act in the way you're describing?
The chairman of the board. The chairperson of the board is the person. That's why the relationship between the executive director and the chairperson of the board is critical in terms of trust. Right? They should be fully aligned and bringing on people that are, so invariably the chairperson of the board and the executive committee are responsible. And we just ran into such a situation where we had a delinquent board member on one of our clients in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And instead of ignoring it and letting that person do damage, we addressed it immediately through the executive committee and the chairperson of the board. They then met with that person who agreed to step down immediately, essentially. So you call them out. There should be no informal organization in terms of, sort of a backroom organization within the board. Everything should be formalized and overt and completely formal, as I mentioned. Another good question.
Great. Thanks so much for your time today, Rob, and thanks everybody for joining us. Hans will follow up shortly with a link to the Tennessee soccer platform that will be on Cogeo's website. From there, you'll be able to access this the recording of this webinar, as well as the resources that were mentioned throughout it, and an easy way to contact Cogeo in case you have any follow-up questions or want to get a hold of us to talk strategy. So thanks again for joining, and have a great rest of your day.